Hey, welcome back to another episode of Projecting Grandeur. I'm your host, Ron Dichter. Very excited for today's show. I have a really special guest, Savannah Keys. She's going to talk about the heartfelt, she's the heartfelt voice behind Everyday Infertility, which is an amazing podcast that we'll talk about throughout the show here. And I'm just really excited to hear Savannah's story and her experiences. Savannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ron. It's my first time to be on this side of a podcast. So I'm excited, but a little nervous.
Well, we have a very accommodating audience, so don't be nervous. All right, so Savannah, what inspired you to start, the Everyday Infertility podcast, and how did your personal experiences shape really its inception?
Yeah, so a quick little background. So, me and my husband, we struggled to get pregnant for almost 4 years. And for that first year, we were kind of just going through life like, why isn't this happening? Why is it taking so long? There's a lot of unknowns. And so, we do what everybody else does. We go to the doctor and we went to several different doctors. And I'll never forget, it was actually on our anniversary that we received the diagnosis: you will never naturally conceive. And, in that moment, it was almost out of the movies where, a doctor's telling you something and you just completely zone out. You don't hear anything. And the whole time I'm thinking, I have no idea what this means. You don't learn about this in school. You don't hear a lot of people talk about it. I had no idea what that really meant. And so that's not a place that I'm comfortable. Let's be honest, I'm a little bit of a control freak. I like to know the answer of what's coming next. I like to problem solve. And so, I come home and we're sitting at the dining room table and we're in complete silence. And of course, I pull out my phone and I get on Google. And just like anybody, you go to WebMD, you go to all of these things, and it's like scare tactic, trauma, negative, all of these things. And my husband's like, you can't get on Google. And I'm like, well, where am I supposed to learn these things? I call my parents. They have no experience with it. I talk to my best friends. They have no experience with it. Well, where am I going to learn these things? And how are we going to, go from A to Z and take that next step? So try and stay away from Google. I get on social media. My generation loves TikTok. So I get on TikTok and I'm finding these things, but nothing's answering my questions. I love podcasts. So I start listening to a couple podcasts, and podcast after podcast is just these doctors coming on. And they're like, well, if this is your diagnosis, do this. Or I did this. And I'm like, this is not what I'm looking for. Number one, how do I cope with this diagnosis? How do I just hear from a real life person, like, it's going to be okay? And how do I just hear other people's stories of them navigating through this? Because it's not linear. It's not, you go to the doctor, you start IVF, you get pregnant. It's, how do I find a doctor? How do I know what questions to ask when I'm sitting down with that doctor? What do next steps look like? How am I supposed to feel throughout all of this? So, most of the online resources weren't pointing me to what I needed. And I really just wanted a space that not only I can learn from it, but other people could learn as well. So that's kind of how it got its legs.
Very cool. Well, don't go on Google. Like I had a hangnail once, and next thing you know, I was going to be dying in the week. So fortunately, I
Protect
made it through
yourself.
that.
Yes, absolutely.
So can you share a pivotal moment in your fertility journey where
Yeah.
you decided to share this publicly? Because that takes some courage.
Yeah. Me and my husband are pretty outgoing people. We're open books. There's not a lot. I tell people I meet you and I know your life story and you know mine within the first, 30 minutes. And so the first couple of weeks, it's not that we kept it secret. It's just such an odd thing to go waving around. And when you see your friends like, oh, hey, we were told we'll never have kids, you don't necessarily want to just dump that on people. And so I remember coming to my husband and I was like, hey, you've been a great support system. Our family has been a great support system. My three best friends have been really great, but we're also getting people asking us, when are you going to have kids? I remember buying a new car and posting it on Instagram, and everyone was like, mom mobile, when are you having kids next? And so part of me wanted to just blanket let everybody know, but also I didn't want people asking the questions when I did see them. And so I asked him, "Are you okay if I post this on my personal Instagram page?" And he was like, "Yeah, do whatever you need to do." Not that it's embarrassing, but you feel that, like, what are people going to think? And so we had that conversation, and I wanted to make sure he was okay with that. Now, I do not have a very large social media following by any means, maybe 1,500 Instagram friends. And so I posted on Instagram, and I get this overwhelming response of people that I've known my whole life, close friends of mine, people I don't even know, reaching out, personally messaging me saying, "I'm going through the same thing. I felt like I've had nobody to talk to. Would you be open to being that person?" And I remember thinking, well, that's odd. Some of these people I know and I talk to often, I would have never known. And so I continue to share. We started our IVF journey, and I remember posting a picture like we're starting the egg retrieval process. And same thing, it was like every time I would post an update, I'd get this, I'm talking 50 messages sometimes of people wanting to talk about it, either share their experience or give tips or ask questions or, "Hey, can I introduce you to my friend's cousin who's also going through this?" And after about 6 months of having similar responses to any time I would post, I thought to myself, what if I created a podcast? And I was like, that's silly, but it was a continuous thought in the back of my mind. And I remember, I don't know why I was like embarrassed to tell someone, like, "Oh, I want to start a podcast." But I was shopping with my best friend. She lives in Texas. So we drove down for the weekend, and we're in this store. And I was like, "Okay, what if I start a podcast on the topic?" And she was so supportive. She was like, "You have to, like, I feel like people are drawn to your story. I think you should really do it." So I tell my husband on the drive back, and he's like, "Absolutely. What equipment do we need to get you?" And so I dove in head first. And as you know, you have to research how to do a podcast. And it was a good um, distraction for a time as well, as how am I going to create this? Is this a little side business that I'm doing? And so I launched the podcast, and it took off like wildfire. And so, I think it really started with that Instagram and the fact that I saw that there was a need from such a small subset of people. And I remember launching the podcast, and I told my husband, I said, if I get one person that reaches out from the podcast and is like, "This helped me," my goal would be made.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that story. And you're right. It's scary until you do it, and then it's like,
Yeah,
gosh, why did I not do this? Yeah. Uh,
absolutely.
you've been obviously very open about undergoing multiple IVF cycles and surgeries.
Yeah.
These experiences, how have they impacted really your perspective on resilience and really hope?
Yeah, there's kind of a two-pronged answer to that. So during the journey, and since I've come out with the podcast, it was our fifth cycle of IVF that we did get pregnant, and I had a healthy pregnancy, gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy who's now 16 months old. So yes, there was a bright light at the end of the tunnel for me, and I'm very grateful for the journey that led me to that. However, during, it is such a it's a very deep, experience that you're going through, and there's high highs and there's very very low lows. And I unfortunately rode all of those, from failed cycles to false positive pregnancy tests to we had an incident where an embryo was lost. So I feel like I have really went through the gamut of infertility journeys specific to my IVF journey. And during that time, it was really hard to have hope and have resiliency, because you feel like you take 10 steps forward and then you get kicked in the teeth, and you're back 50 steps, and that's really hard. And so creating this outlet and connecting with so many people really did give me that hope. And it almost forced me to have that hope, even if sometimes it was a fake it till you make it type of hope. But talking with so many other people and hearing them say, it took me years and then we, ended up conceiving and having a baby, or, talking to people that still hadn't had that, happy ending and they're still doing it. So it's like, okay, I have to fight for this. I want this so badly. I have to keep the hope and that resiliency. But it was hard. Now, on the other side of it, and that's one thing that I've tried to be really honest and make sure I'm aware of, is not saying on the other side of it, because the reality is, for me specifically, I will always have to do IVF. We will never conceive naturally. It is not an option for us. And so I try not to say that, because there are those miracle stories out there where someone does IVF once and then they're able to naturally get pregnant, or they are truly on the other side of it, where they've went through whatever they did, whether it's IUI or IVF, or, they conceived naturally, they're done having children, and they are on the other side of that. For me, I'm not, because we want more kids and we will have to go through IVF. But this side, it is a little bit different. Because I have a baby and I spent so many years pleading and begging and praying, like, if I could just have one child. And now I do, and I am forever grateful. And you look at things so differently, at least for me and those that I've had conversations with that have went through the journey. You do appreciate parenting so different. You appreciate pregnancy very different. Um, but now I have that. And so there is a little bit of my heart that's kind of healed from that. But I do know, and there is that hope and resiliency of like, okay, what happens with round two? We know, getting to baby number one was not easy. What if that's the case for number two? And I do have to think it happened once. Hopefully it'll happen again. But they're different, I think it's okay during the journey to have different stages of hope and resiliency and grief and doubt and all of those things.
Yeah. Well, you talk about, the lows, and, I can just
Yeah.
picture, this emotional roller coaster, which is,
Yeah.
tough, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, there has to be, during that time, especially during the lows, like,
Yeah.
what were the coping mechanisms or support systems, that you found to be most effective? Because there's probably a lot of listeners out there that are not too dissimilar that don't know how to handle those lows. Like, what did you find to help you through these challenging times?
Yeah. Everybody's different. And that's one thing that I've had a lot of conversations with. And I even did an entire episode solely on coping. Um, you know, Luckily for me, I have an awesome support system. And one thing that me and my husband, sat down early on, and I can't remember if I read it somewhere or someone told me or what, but the divorce rates going through infertility are very high. And it's because, depending on everybody's situation, you could blame your partner could be blaming you, it's very hard. And so we had a very honest conversation of, if we are feeling something, we have to tell each other. We don't want to bottle it up. And so, a lot of the times my husband was my rock, and he was the one supporting me. And I was going to him saying, like, what if this never happens? Here's my doubts, going to him crying, going to him upset because I have to go to another baby shower this weekend. And how do I, fake it and not, take away from that experience? What was actually really surprisingly hard, and I am very open, it was me that couldn't conceive. And we ended up doing a surgery where they removed my tubes, and that's actually what helped us get pregnant. So I felt a lot of the time it was me. I'm the reason. I should be blamed. Maybe you're better off. You could have married someone that could have given you kids. And he was so amazing. I tell him all the time, you deserve the world for how you handled it. What was hard for me is when he would actually come to me and share his thoughts and feelings, because as the person that could be blamed, you have to his feelings are valid. It's not my fault. I can't put my own feelings on top of his. So having the relationship between your partner is so important, and I would not have gotten through it without him. I also, my best friends were really, really great. And my best friends are in all different phases of life. My best friend of 18 years had two kids throughout the time that we were going through this. And that's hard for anybody personally experiencing it to sit by, but she was so amazing in how she told me she was pregnant. I planned both of her baby showers. I'm the godmother of her children. And so it was very special, but it was very hard. And she was so amazing during that time. And they let me come to them and cry, vent, scream, all of the things. But also, part of the coping is that I didn't stop living life. And I've made a lot of connections in this space. And what I saw, number one, is marriages started to crumble. Number two, a lot of resentment built up in friendships. I saw a lot of women like, well, my best friend, doesn't understand why I don't want to go to her baby shower. And that is really hard to continue living life with all of the things around you and all of those relationships. But the other thing is, I saw a lot of women and couples, especially, just stop doing things. Well, we're not going to plan that summer vacation because we don't know if we'll be in an IVF cycle, or we don't know if we'll be pregnant. And you're just always like, you're planning every single bit of your life around your infertility. And that was hard, but we continued to travel, and we took some of our most favorite trips during that time. And we had awesome bonding experiences, and we did so many things that we would have put on hold if we let ourselves live in that. I remember we bought concert tickets, and I was like, well, we may or may not be pregnant. It ended up we were pregnant, and it was so fun to go to a concert, and be pregnant, and all of the things. I got such great special treatment from everybody. But we that was one of the biggest things outside of the relationships, is I did not let it affect my day-to-day life as much as I saw others doing so.
Yeah, I love that. Sounds like a great guy, by the way.
Yes,
Uh, so you kind of touched on this, but just want to just tap into it a little bit further. So we've talked
yeah.
about people reaching out to you,
Yeah.
but how is really sharing this story through your podcast influenced your relationship with your listeners facing these same struggles?
Yeah, I will say that the connecting with my listeners has been the most rewarding piece. And I'm from Oklahoma, and so sometimes I often think like, I'm a girl from small town Oklahoma, born, raised, never left. I have this podcast that my goal was, if I could just help one person, like, I think I would feel like I've done some good, like I've given back. And I sometimes have to pinch myself. It's been streamed in almost 100 countries. It's been downloaded, I think last time I looked, like over 20,000 episodes. I ended up creating an email, everydayinfertility@gmail.com, specifically for all the logins to the podcast platforms and all of that. But I started at the end of every episode, like, if you want to connect, reach out. And I did not think, who's going to email a podcast? And I surprisingly got so many emails. And I created an Instagram for it and all of that. So I was connecting with people, what felt like left and right. But it was really the email for me, for someone to take time, email, not know if they're going to get a response, and tell me their story. And I'm talking heartfelt stories where it's paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs. And it was so cool because people would be like, I'm writing you from Germany, was one of them, and I'm writing you from South Africa. And I even had people write locally from Oklahoma, which I just thought was so cool, that they took time to send me an email and pour their heart out and tell me this story. And oftentimes they weren't asking a question, and they weren't really even, there wasn't a response that was required. And those were the most important ones for me, because I know they needed to vent just as much as I needed that in the beginning. And so that was so special to me. And what's, you know, so warm and fuzzy and heartfelt is I actually logged into the email. So I did a season 1. I took a break for a while. I am working to get back to season 2, but I logged in and I had a email chain from a woman that I connected with probably within like my second month of operating the podcast. And she had shared her story with me, and I wrote back and I was like, thanks so much, thinking of you, blah, 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 whatever. And about 3 weeks ago, I had an email from her on that same thread saying I'm pregnant. And those are the things that just like, so many people have podcasts out there, and I love podcasts. I think that is just so cool to have such a share that moment with someone, a life changing moment. And not saying my podcast intervened in any way, but I have had women reach out and say, because of, you mentioned this in your podcast, I went back to my doctor, I asked for this test. Now we're pregnant. Or you interviewed this person. I would have never thought to do this because of them or ask for that or, blah, 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 blah. And so, you do feel like you have like a teeny 1%, marking of their story. And that is so neat. And I think that has been the coolest part, is really connecting with people all over the world, which is crazy to say.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, kind of just along the same lines, and this might be a little bit repetitive, but I think it's really important. Like,
Yeah.
as you think about community, as you think about shared
Yeah.
experiences,
Yeah.
and you put it in the context of infertility, like, how do those play such an important role together?
It's funny, there's a saying in the infertility world, and by the way, I am a part of, Facebook groups that have hundreds of thousands of people in it. I am a part of smaller groups. I've met with people in person. I have my podcast. I get, reached out to people. There's this saying across all of infertility is worst club, best members. And I think that really rings true in this community because you don't know what's next. No one can see the future. And oftentimes, whether it's someone not having a diagnosis and they're going through this and they have no idea if they're ever going to get pregnant, or they have a diagnosis and they're scratching and clawing and trying to, figure out how they get to that next step, or even people that have went through it and they have the traumas. That's something that's also not talked about is the lasting trauma. For me, pregnancy was really hard because you're waiting for that shoe to drop because of the previous trauma from it. Then I think for baby number 2, you still have those same things. And so the community, whether you are day 1 of your infertility journey or you are 10 years later, it is such a tight knit community. And I think when you really look at what that community is built on, is it's just an immense amount of empathy. You want something so bad, no matter if this person's story is totally different than you can connect on the fact that you both have probably felt the same way and experienced the same feelings and, cried the same tears and, pleaded the same prayers and all of this stuff. And so the community aspect has been so amazing. And the fact that it's still such a taboo topic, even people that don't know I have a podcast that I've connected with it. It's that same feeling of community. Or, I remember talking to a gal that I just met out in public and didn't even tell her I have a podcast, didn't even anything. And the things that she was saying, I'm like, oh my gosh, you don't know this, but there is such a strong community behind you, and women that will lift you up from all over the place with all different stories and all different backgrounds. And it's so awesome. And so, one, that has been so important to me. And I have forever vowed to myself and others, whether I am, it's today or I'm 99, this will always be such an important community to me. But it also has opened my eyes to so many other things outside of infertility. There's so many communities based on so many different things. Whether it's a loss of a parent or a different type of diagnosis or something you're going on in your life, you know, finding community when you're going through something is so important. It's important to have your support system. My husband, he was going through it, but in his own way. My best friends were going through it because they were supporting me, but they've never experienced it. And you find this community of people who get it. And I think that is so important for anybody out there going through anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. That's so true. Now that you're a podcast, a celebrity, don't sell yourself short here,
No,
Savannah.
no, 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 no.
You talk about being vulnerable. You talk about your personal journey, which is a hard story. I mean, candidly, I get a little choked up hearing some of the stories that you're telling already.
Yeah.
How do you balance like having that vulnerable side, but also being that strong, supportive figure that people can look up to as they're going through this?
Yeah. I think it takes a certain type of person. And really, I think I've always been that person. I have a very strong outer shell exterior. And that's been me my whole life. And surprisingly, for someone who has a podcast, I am not a very vulnerable person. My husband tells me all the time, he's like, "Why are you struggling with being vulnerable about this?" And I'm like, "That's just not who I am." I was raised by, a military family who it was always like, you're tough, you're strong, don't let them see you, cry. And so growing up with that background, and that is really who I am today, I think I needed this support. I needed this coping mechanism. I saw how many people needed a voice in this space. And while I have that tough outer shell exterior, and I struggle to be vulnerable, I also have always been that person to have the voice for, like the underdog. Or, I was that kid growing up that was like, well, everybody says, or, the voice of the classroom or whatever. And so, you kind of mix those three things together. I forced myself to be vulnerable, and I think a lot of, I started the podcast audio only. I eventually went to video only. And I'll never forget, it was the first episode I cried. And I remember getting done and I was like, I'm never posting this. Because I was sharing it on YouTube. I was sharing, like I said, almost 100 countries. I'm like, I do not want these people seeing me crying. I don't want anyone to hold this against me of here's, a time when you were vulnerable, or like, oh my gosh, you're crying on the internet. And so it is hard. And I think, like I said, it takes a certain type of person. And that's why you don't see a lot of people with podcast or public platforms talking about a lot of vulnerable things. It's really hard. And like, let's be honest, this is a very vulnerable topic. I remember calling my parents and being like, I'm going to go on the internet and I might talk about sex. I'm going to go on the internet and talk about conceiving a child. Born and raised Oklahoma, Southern Baptist. I'm like, what is my family going to think? And so, vulnerability, not just in being able to like break down those walls and let people like hear my open thoughts and feelings about this, but also this is an awkward topic to talk about. And so, I think all that to say is it was really hard. It requires a certain type of person. I think I saw the need for it and I saw that I could be that person. And I think that's been really appreciated in this space is a lot of people, when they originally reach out to me, they say, "Thank you for sharing your story. I could never." And that makes my heart hurt because I don't want these people to never share it. And a lot of people do. A lot of people keep this, as a secret. And a lot of people don't talk to family and friends because they're scared of how it's going to be perceived. Or a lot of people just are scared to be vulnerable. And so I had to put my fear of being vulnerable aside to really accomplish that.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just picturing to be a fly in the wall in that conversation with your military family in that first conversation. So
Yeah, and it's so funny because my dad has been like one of my biggest supporters, and I remember he would listen to an episode, and then dads with technology, he'd like screenshot me a picture of the actual podcast and send it to me, and I just know I'm like, okay, so you listened to it, and he'd be like, great episode. I'm like, Oh, wow. Okay, that was the episode between me and my husband talking about, our marriage and all of the things that infertility has, taught us along the way. And I'm like, "Hey, Dad, thank you for listening."
So how is navigating infertility, building a big brand, talking about all the things we've been talking about today, and then also balancing your professional life and your personal life? Like, how has all of that intersected, and how have you been able to kind of keep things straight?
Yeah, that has been hard. And that is something I personally had to learn for myself. I was very lucky, and I still am very lucky to work for an organization that was supportive. And I can tell you from the conversations that I've had from women in this community, in this space, that is pretty rare. And when you think about it, when you think about someone's job, how easy is it for them to take off work? How easy is it for them to carry that mental load? If they're going to need to be gone for certain days, it really does affect your work pretty significantly. Now, with IVF, you go through different phases. There's like the egg retrieval phase, which is pretty short. It's 10 days, but then, you go in for a surgery, you're out for a day or two. During that time, you are pumping your body with just mass amounts of hormones. So, there were days I didn't feel good. There were days I felt really great. There were days I felt sick. There were days I felt tired. It's really hard. And then there's a bunch of waiting period. And during that waiting period, you're waiting to find out, how many of those eggs turned into embryos and how many of those embryos, came back as, normal, or, they passed the genetic testing. Then you wait, and then you go in and you start doing the testing, and it is blood work, sometimes multiple times a week. And so you're driving to a clinic to get blood work done, and you come back, and, all this to say is there were times where I was away from work a lot. One thing that was really helpful for me is I was really open and honest. I remember talking to my boss at the time, talking to HR. Hey guys, I don't know what this is going to look like. They're telling me I'm going to need to take some time away from work. Like, I want to make this work. Can you guys work with me? And they were super supportive. Luckily, the clinic that we spent, about 2 years with was like 10 minutes from my office, which is also very unheard of because each state really only has a handful of fertility clinics spread out across, for Oklahoma, we have three. So I was very lucky that it was, 10-15 minute drive. So that actually played in my favor. Also, in today's day and age with work, we were coming off the heels of COVID. So we were really just entering our remote work from home, hybrid type office situation. But I also worked for an organization that really believed in me and said, get your work done and we don't care. And I think that is healthy, for infertility aside, that is just a healthy work organization. But they knew, they were like, okay, Savannah's been with us a couple years. We know she's not going to just abandon post. She's going to do what she needs to do to get the job done. And so, that is hard. And I can't tell you that every day I was 100% because there's a lot going on. I remember our first round, you go in, you do the transfer, you wait a couple weeks, you go back, you take a blood test, and they call you and tell you if you're pregnant. And I remember I was in office that day, and I told my team, because I was managing a team at the time, and I told my boss, I was like, guys, I'm going to try and leave at lunch so I can be home for this news, whether it's positive or negative. I want to be home. That way, if it's bad news, I'm not putting a damper on everybody's day. I'm not here at work, all of that. If it is positive, like, I'm celebrating. And I remember the news was obviously negative. And I get the news. I did not have time to drive home. So I get the call while I'm in office. And I remember I shut the door to my office. I took the call. It's heartbreaking. It's your first round. You expect it to work, and it doesn't. And I remember I drove home. Everybody in the office knew. So I'm getting texts like, so sorry, we're here for you. But our CEO at the time, a couple days later was like, take as much time as you need. Like, we're here for you. This is hard. Take as much time as you need. And that meant the world to me that he cared to reach out. But two, I was like, hey, I don't need the time. actually work as a good distraction for me. So it is hard, and if that story gives you, an inkling of what it's like, 3.5 years while you're juggling working and of course I'm trying to, be the best I can at work and, grow in my career. And, I accepted a new role within that time. And so a lot of change is happening. And so it was really hard. I eventually, I would say about the 6 month to a year mark, like I got in my groove and it was very easy to dissociate. So when I'm at work, it is work. And when I am going to you know, an appointment or whatever, I really just had to separate the two. I've had a lot of conversations with women in the professional space that they don't have that and it's really hard and I don't have the advice for them of what to do. Talking with HR is really important. Unfortunately, some of the stories I've heard is women do have to get different jobs or change what that looks like. And you want to talk about life changing. And I don't think it should be that way, but it's just unfortunately the world we live in.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it worked well in your situation. So hopefully, maybe employers that are listening to this will take note of that.
Fingers
So, since becoming a mom, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
How has your perspective, kind of like shifted as you've gone into this new phase, and as you think about your audience, what new insights can you bring to them now with that you're kind of not on the other side, as you said, but that
Yeah.
you've had, kind of this win, this small, success.
Yeah. That has been something that I truly struggle with. And the reason being is because I will never forget how I felt during the journey. And I think a lot of women going through this feel the same way. It is, and I think we're all human when we look at someone else and think they have what I don't have, or they got to experience what I didn't get to experience. And that is the really harsh reality of going through infertility is that throughout that time, I'm looking at my friends, they're getting pregnant, and I'm thinking, why is that not me? Poor me, poor me, poor me. I have to go to a baby shower. How am I going to possibly get through this? How am I going to watch someone opening gifts for something that I want so badly? And so I am not naive to the fact, and I really try and apply the lens that every single one of my listeners is in that mindset. Because when you're in that mindset or that headspace, your feelings are valid no matter if I tell you they're valid or not. And the amount of times I had people throughout my journey say, oh, well, just, everything happens at the right time. Just relax. Not necessarily something you want to tell someone. It's like telling a really mad person, oh, just calm down. It doesn't work like that. And so I really try and be mindful of the language that I use. I would never tell someone, like, your time's coming. Don't worry about it. Because in that headspace for me, is that time ever coming? Will that time ever come? What do I do if that time doesn't come? And that's a very scary place to operate. And so, being a mother, what I try and tell everybody is the journey sucked. It was so bad. And I lived in that journey. I experienced the high highs, I experienced the low lows. I would not trade that journey for the world because of where I am right now. And I tell everybody, especially going through it, I say, this is, your feelings are valid and this is really hard. And everything you're experiencing, like, I've been there. I know. What I can tell you is when the time comes, if the time comes, it is so worth it. And that was weird for me because the reality is every single person telling me, and it always came from such a good place. That's the thing is no one ever had ill intent in their advice for me. But when you're going through it and someone says, it'll happen when timing's perfect. For me, I'm like, F you. That is not what I want to hear at this time. When we got pregnant, one of the first things I told my husband is I was like, wow, it happened when timing was perfect. Would I of course love to save the, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars we've spent on this and the heartache and the this and the that. It happened in the most serene time of our lives. Like we truly were like, it couldn't have happened at a better time for us. Um, and it just felt right. Now that's hard to tell someone when they are questioning if it's ever going to happen. So being on this side, being on, being a mother, experiencing this is very different. And I do have such an immense respect for anybody going through it, have gone through it, anything like that. But you do appreciate it. I appreciate all of the heartache and, horrible things that we went through because I do feel I have a stronger appreciation for my child. And I look at him and, it's so funny. I tell my husband all the time, I'm like, I got invited to like go to a girls' night or whatever. I want to spend time with my child, like I can't wait to be with him. And I think there's just, I don't think anybody says this negatively, but I have girlfriends that are like, oh, I can't wait for a break for my child. And I just think have a different outlook on things of like, yeah, parenting's really hard. And do I need some me time and a break occasionally? Yeah, but I just look at things so differently. And I always try and keep that lens of, what I went through, where I'm at today, where I'm going to be tomorrow, and how anybody that I interact with in those stages, where they might be, and how my story can kind of help them or give them hope or at least tell them like you're not alone. We've been through it. I've been through it.
Yeah, it's a nice message. I'll enjoy that time. It goes fast. I have two in college. It goes very fast.
It
Uh,
does go so fast.
yeah. Well, one last question. I know I'm a little
Yeah.
over on the time you gave me, which I'm so gracious for. But as you look at future day or the future of everyday infertility,
Yeah.
like what are your aspirations? What do you hope to see it grow into? Like
Yeah.
I'm dying to chapter two or season two. Like tell me what's next.
Yeah, so season 2 is next. And I put off season 2 for a long time because one, I wanted to enjoy my pregnancy. I wanted to enjoy those, early newborn days, but I also felt a little guilty coming to such a large audience and being like, I have a baby. And so I've had to deal with my own feelings on that. However, I have some really great ideas for topics because I'm not the only one that has gotten pregnant after years of infertility or had a child after years of infertility or went for round 2 and, start the whole process over again. So, a couple things that I think I'd love to share with my audience is what is pregnancy like after infertility? Because it is very different. What is, parenthood like after infertility? Because as I mentioned, I have such a different viewpoint on things, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel for most people. And I think people should take that time and really live in that space. And I haven't thought about the next round or what that will look like often because I want to soak this time up. I really enjoyed interviewing people because my story will really only take people so far. And it'll only help such a teeny amount of people in this space be able to say, okay, Savannah's diagnosis was this, and she did this, and here's what came from it, and maybe I can take something from that. And so I interviewed some amazing women along the way. I interviewed a surrogate. I interviewed, an individual who, interviewing in the process of adoption and things like that. And so I think there's so many more stories that I can tell. And that's what I really loved. So that's what will, be unfolding in season 2. And I hope that, again, it just helps one more person.
It's amazing. Well, your story's great. I can tell you care tremendously about what you're doing. And I just thank you so much for not
Yeah.
only joining us today, but creating this empathetic community of people going through something similar. So, for our audience, how do they find your podcast if they want to go back and watch the beginning episodes? And then how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am streaming anywhere you get your podcasts. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere. like that, you just search Everyday Infertility and that first season will come up. You can also, like I mentioned earlier in this episode, I started publishing them on YouTube. So if you're not a listener type person, you're more visual, I have a couple of those episodes with video on YouTube. And then if you want to reach out to me, everydayinfertility@gmail.com, or I'm also on Instagram at everydayinfertility.
Awesome. Well, Savannah, thanks again for taking time out of your day. I know it's busy. Congrats again on being a mother, and really appreciated you sharing your story today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Ron. This was really fun being on this side of things. And again, your podcast is awesome. So I'm just excited and grateful to be a guest.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, everybody else, remember, please like and comment. Don't forget to follow Savannah and check out all the great things she's got going on. And until next time, keep growing, everyone. Have a great day.